She expected a cruel husband. Cowboy met her at the train and said, "I'll be kind." The wind had teeth and it bit at the exposed skin on her face and hands. It was a high, lonesome sound, a keening cry that swept across the vast, empty plains and funneled down the single dusty street of Redemption, a town that seemed to have forgotten the meaning of its own name. The train had hissed and groaned to a stop, depositing her and the boy on the splintered platform like a piece of unwanted luggage, before pulling away with a mournful shriek, leaving behind a profound and terrible silence. Alara clutched her son's small hand, his fingers cold even through his thin mittens. Leo, all of 6 years old, pressed against her leg, his wide eyes taking in the raw, unforgiving landscape. There was nothing here, nothing but dirt, sky, and the wind. "Manga." His voice was a small thing, nearly stolen by the gale. She squeezed his hand, a gesture meant to convey a confidence she did not possess. "It's all right, little bird. We're here now." Where here was, she couldn't rightly say. A place at the end of a long, rattling journey, paid for with the last of her dignity. A name on a piece of paper, a man she had never met, a bargain struck from desperation. The advertisement had been spare, clinical, wife wanted. Sober, hard-working man. Modest homestead, passage paid. It had not mentioned kindness. It had not mentioned cruelty either, but Alara had learned to expect the latter. The world had taught her that bargains made by hungry women were rarely honored with gentleness. So she braced herself, a familiar tightening in her chest, a shield she had carried for so long it felt a part of her own ribs. She expected a man with hard eyes and harder hands, a man who would see her as another piece of property, like a plow or a mule. A man separated himself from the shadows of the station depot. He was tall, his frame lean but broad in the shoulders, outlined by the unforgiving afternoon light. He wore a dusty hat pulled low, casting his face in shadow. He moved with a slow, deliberate gait that spoke of a life lived at the pace of the seasons, not the frantic ticking of a city clock. He stopped a few feet from them, his gaze falling first on Leo, then lifting to her. She could not see his eyes clearly, but she felt their weight. He was not old, perhaps 35, but he looked worn, weathered by the sun and something deeper, a sorrow that had settled into the lines around his mouth. Silence stretched between them, taut and fragile. The only sound was the incessant wind and the frantic beating of her own heart. This was it, the man whose name was Silas, the man who now owned her future. She readied the words she had practiced, the polite, subservient greeting of a woman who knew her place. But he spoke first. His voice was low and rough, like stones grinding in a riverbed. It wasn't unkind, just unused. He looked directly at her, and for a moment the shadow shifted, revealing eyes the color of a stormy sky. They held no fire, no greed, only a vast, tired emptiness. "I'll be kind." The words were so unexpected they seemed to hang in the air, a different kind of silence falling in their wake. It was not a promise made with passion, not a vow whispered with feeling. It was a statement of fact, a simple, stark declaration, delivered with the same gravity he might use to say, "The well is deep or winter is coming." She stared at him, searching for the trick, the hidden clause in this verbal contract. There was none. There was only the man, the wind, and those 4 quiet words that landed in the barren soil of her heart and felt, terrifyingly, like the first drop of rain after a long drought. A single tear, hot and sharp, escaped her eye and was instantly dried by the wind. He saw it. He gave a short, almost imperceptible nod, as if acknowledging a debt, then turned toward a wagon hitched nearby. He did not offer to take her worn satchel, nor did he touch her. He simply waited. It was a choice, her first in a very long time. She took a breath, the cold air searing her lungs, and led her son toward the wagon. She had come here expecting a cage. He had offered a shelter instead. And in the heart of that desolate landscape, the difference was everything. The journey to his homestead was a study in silence. The wagon wheels groaned over the rutted track, and the hooves of the two sturdy horses fell in a steady, rhythmic plod. Silas handled the reins with an economy of motion, his gaze fixed on the endless horizon. He did not speak again, and Alara did not dare to. She sat on the hard bench, her arm wrapped tight around Leo, who had finally succumbed to exhaustion and fallen asleep against her side, his small face peaceful for the first time in days. She watched the land unfurl around them. It was a country of stark and brutal beauty, the plains rolling out in waves of pale gold and brown, stretching to a sky so immense it seemed to press down on the earth. There were no trees to soften the view, no gentle hills to break the monotony. It was a place that demanded strength, that would scour away anything soft or weak. Like her. She studied the man beside her, taking in the details she had missed on the platform. The worn collar of his denim jacket, the calloused knuckles of his hands on the reins, the way his jaw was set in a permanent line of tension. He was a man accustomed to solitude. It clung to him like the dust on his boots. She wondered about the guilt she thought she'd seen in his eyes. What had a man like this done, out here in the middle of nowhere, to earn such a burden? What loss had hollowed him out so completely? She pushed the questions away. It was not her place to ask. Her place was to survive. Her place was to keep her son safe. His past was his own. His present, she now understood with a chilling certainty, was also hers. After what felt like an eternity, a small structure materialized in the distance, a dark speck against the bruised purple of the twilight sky. As they drew closer, she saw it was a cabin, built of rough-hewn logs, with a stone chimney releasing a thin ribbon of smoke. A small barn stood nearby, and a fenced corral held a few more horses. It was stark, isolated, a tiny island of human effort in an ocean of wilderness. There was no garden, no sign of a woman's touch. Just the cabin, the barn, and the wind. Silas brought the wagon to a halt near the porch. He swung down from the seat with a practiced, weary grace. "This is it." He gestured toward the cabin. He still did not offer to help her down. He went to the back of the wagon and began unhitching the horses, his movements efficient and sure. Alara carefully shifted Leo, rousing him gently. The boy woke with a small, confused whimper, blinking in the fading light. "We're here, my love," she whispered, her voice tight. She climbed down from the wagon, her legs stiff and unsteady. She pulled their single, battered satchel with her and guided Leo toward the cabin door. It was unlocked. She pushed it open and stepped inside, her heart pounding a nervous rhythm against her ribs. The interior was one large room, spare and meticulously clean. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, a low fire crackling within, casting dancing shadows on the wooden floor. A sturdy table with two chairs stood in the center. A bed, neatly made with a dark wool blanket, was tucked into a corner. Along the far wall was a dry sink, a wood-burning stove for cooking, and shelves holding a few tin plates, cups, and basic provisions. It was a man's space, functional and devoid of comfort. But it was warm and it was out of the wind. Silas entered behind them, carrying a pail of water. He did not look at her as he set it on the dry sink. He moved to a curtained-off alcove she hadn't noticed. He pulled the rough burlap curtain aside, revealing a small, windowless space containing another bed, this one smaller, little more than a cot with a thin mattress and a single folded blanket. "This will be yours," he said, his voice flat. He looked at Leo, who was hiding behind Alara's skirts. "The boy can sleep with you." He turned and went back to the main room, stoking the fire until it blazed brighter, pushing back the encroaching chill of the night. He took a pot from a hook and began to prepare a simple meal of beans and salted pork, his back to her the entire time. He moved with the quiet competence of a man long used to fending for himself. Alara stood in the doorway of her small, dark room, watching him. This was her new life. A silent man, a single room, and a curtain for a door. He had promised kindness, but this was not kindness as she had ever known it. It was a deliberate, almost clinical absence of cruelty. He provided shelter. He provided warmth. He provided food. But he offered no conversation, No welcome, no touch. He had drawn a line down the center of the cabin, and she knew, without him having to say a word, that she was not to cross it. She was a presence he would tolerate, a responsibility he had, for some unknowable reason, taken upon himself. She was not a wife. She was a tenant, and the rent was her silence. She pulled the burlap curtain closed, shutting them into the small, dark space. She sat on the edge of the cot, pulling Leo into her lap, and held him as he drifted back to sleep, listening to the lonely sounds of a stranger moving in his own home. The days settled into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the silence. Silas rose before dawn, the scrape of his boots on the floorboards the first sound Alara would hear. He would tend to the fire, his movements quiet and efficient, before heading out to the barn. He worked his small herd of cattle, mended fences, and chopped wood, his solitary figure a constant presence on the vast landscape. He was tireless, driven by a relentless energy that seemed to find its only outlet in physical labor. He never spoke to her in the mornings. By the time she and Leo emerged from behind their burlap curtain, he was gone. A routine formed between them, an unspoken agreement. He left a stack of freshly cut firewood on the porch each morning. He left a pail of clean water by the door. In return, Alara took over the care of the cabin. She cooked, her movements tentative at first, unsure of his tastes. She made thin stews and baked dense, serviceable bread in the cast-iron stove. She washed their few dishes. She swept the rough plank floors. One afternoon, finding a pile of his mending in a corner, she picked up a shirt, its cuff torn. Using the small sewing kit from her satchel, she repaired it with neat, tiny stitches. She left it folded on the seat of his chair. He never mentioned it, but the next day, another shirt appeared in its place. It became another part of their silent language. He provided the wood. She provided the mending. They ate their meals in the same room, but never together. She would feed Leo early, a small portion of whatever she had cooked, and then they would retreat to their alcove. Later, she would hear the cabin door open and close, the sound of Silas moving about the room. She would hear the scrape of a chair, the clink of a fork against a tin plate. He ate alone, staring into the fire. The silence in the cabin was a living thing, thick and heavy with unspoken thoughts, with the ghosts of his past and the fears for her future. Leo was her shadow, a quiet, watchful boy who rarely spoke above a whisper. He had been boisterous once, in another life, but hardship had dimmed his light. Here, in this quiet house with this silent man, he seemed to shrink even further into himself. He played on the floor with a few smooth stones he'd found, his games as silent as the world around him. Alara's heart ached for him, for the laughter she no longer heard, for the childhood that was being whittled away by uncertainty. Sometimes, she would watch Silas from the small window as she washed the dishes. He moved with a strength that was plain to see, but there was a weariness in his posture that spoke of more than physical exhaustion. He often paused in his work, staring out at the horizon, his hand resting on a fence post, utterly still. In those moments, he looked like the loneliest man in the world. She wondered what he saw out there in the endless expanse of grass and sky. Was he looking for something? Or was he looking at something that was already gone? One week bled into the next. The initial terror she had felt began to recede, replaced by a cautious, fragile sense of stability. There were no harsh words, no angry outbursts. There was no drunken stumbling in the night. There was only the steady, predictable rhythm of their separate lives, lived under one roof. He had kept his promise. He was kind in his own spare, distant way. But the distance was a wall as solid as the log cabin itself, and she did not know how to breach it. She wasn't sure she should even try. Trust was a currency she no longer possessed, and she guarded her heart and her son with a fierce, quiet desperation. She had food. She had shelter. For now, it had to be enough. She would mend his shirts and cook his meals and live behind her burlap curtain, and she would wait. She would wait for the other shoe to drop because in her experience it always did. The silence couldn't last forever. Autumn began its slow retreat, the days growing shorter, the wind carrying a sharper bite. The gold of the plains faded to a brittle brown. Silas worked with a new urgency, reinforcing the barn, stacking cords of wood against the cabin until they reached the eaves. He was preparing for winter, a battle against the elements he waged alone every year. Alara found a strange comfort in his preparations. His foresight meant he planned for them to be here when the snows came. It was the closest thing to a promise of a future she had received. One afternoon, while Silas was out checking on the herd, a cold rain began to fall. It quickly turned to a driving sleet. Inside the cabin, Alara noticed a persistent drip in the corner of their small alcove. A dark stain was spreading on the wooden roof beam, and water plinked steadily into a small puddle on the floor. She placed a tin cup to catch it, her anxiety rising with each drop. A leaky roof in winter could mean illness, could mean a misery she could not afford. She didn't know how to fix it, and she was terrified to ask him for help, to be a burden. She said nothing when he returned that evening, soaked to the bone and weary. He ate his meal in his customary silence, and she and Leo stayed in their room, the rhythmic plink, plink, plink of the leak a constant, nagging reminder of their vulnerability. The next day, the storm had passed, leaving behind a clean, cold world. Silas left early as usual. A few hours later, drawn by a noise outside, Alara peered through the window. She saw him on the roof of the cabin, working directly over their section. He was methodically pulling away old shingles and hammering new ones into place, his movements sure and economical. He hadn't said a word. He had seen the cup on the floor when he'd come in for his breakfast tin. He had noticed, and he had acted. She watched him for a long time, a strange warmth spreading through her chest. It was more than just kindness. It was attentiveness. It was care. He was tending to her comfort, to her well-being, without being asked. It was a gesture as quiet and solid as the man himself. Later that week, another small offering appeared. She had taken Leo outside to get a breath of crisp air. On the top step of the porch sat a small, crudely carved horse. It was whittled from a piece of pale pine, its lines simple but surprisingly graceful. It was unmistakably Silas's handiwork. She had seen him mending a harness with the same knife he'd likely used to carve the toy. There was no note, no annoncement. It was just there. Leo saw it at the same time she did. His eyes, usually so solemn, widened with a child's pure delight. He crept forward and picked it up, his small fingers tracing the smooth, sanded wood. He looked up at Alara, a question in his eyes. "It's for you, my love," she said, her voice thick. He clutched the horse to his chest, and for the first time in months, a genuine, unburdened smile lit up his face. He ran a little way into the yard, making the horse gallop through the dusty earth, making small, quiet neighing sounds. The sound of his play, soft as it was a crack in the oppressive silence that had ruled their lives. Alara looked toward the barn, where Silas was working. He was stacking hay, his back to them, but she knew he was aware of them. She knew he could hear the boys' soft noises. This small wooden horse was a bridge, a first step across the chasm of silence that separated them. It was not a grand gesture. It was a small, quiet thing. But out here, in this vast and empty land, small things had to bear the weight of all the words that went unsaid. The sky was turning a heavy, ominous gray in the west. A new storm was gathering, but for the first time, Alara felt the faint, flickering warmth of hope. It was a fragile thing, easily extinguished, but it was there. The blizzard arrived without warning, a white fury that descended upon the plains and erased the world. One moment, the sky was a sheet of bruised pewter. The next, it was a churning vortex of snow and wind. The wind shrieked like a banshee, rattling the very logs of the cabin. Snow piled in deep drifts against the door and sealed the single window with a crust of ice. The world shrank to the four walls of their small shelter, the fire in the hearth their only defense against the crushing cold. That night, Leo began to cough. It was a dry, rasping sound that tore at Alara's heart. She put him to bed on their cot, piling their one thin blanket and her own shawl on top of him. His skin was hot to the touch, his cheeks flushed with fever. His breathing grew shallow and quick. Panic, cold and sharp, seized Alara. She was miles from any town, from any doctor. They were utterly alone, trapped by the storm with a sick child. She spent hours by his side, bathing his forehead with a damp cloth, whispering soothing words he was too delirious to hear. The fire in the main room began to die down, and the chill of the storm seeped through the walls. She knew she had to get more wood, but the pile was outside, and the thought of opening the door to that roaring maelstrom terrified her. As if sensing her distress, the burlap curtain was pushed aside. Silas stood there, his large frame filling the small doorway. His face was grim, his eyes clouded with a concern that transcended their usual distance. He had heard the boys coughing, had heard her pacing. He looked from her frightened face to the small, shivering form on the cot. He didn't ask what was wrong. He could see it. Without a word, he turned and went to the hearth. He stoked the fire, adding logs from the stack inside until it was a roaring blaze, pushing back the encroaching cold. He put a pot of water on to boil. Then he disappeared for a moment, returning from his corner with a thick, heavy wool blanket, the one from his own bed. He walked into their alcove and gently, carefully, laid it over Leo. Alara flinched as he came near, an instinct born of old fears. But his movements were slow, deliberate. His large, calloused hands were surprisingly gentle as he tucked the heavy blanket around the boy's small frame. He didn't look at her. His focus was entirely on the child. He pulled one of the chairs from the table and placed it just outside the burlap curtain. And there he sat. All night long he kept vigil. He did not sleep. Every hour, he would rise to tend the fire, ensuring it never faltered. He would bring her a cup of hot, weak tea, leaving it on the floor for her to take. He never crossed the threshold into her space again, but his presence was a solid, reassuring anchor in the terrifying darkness. He was a sentinel, guarding them against the storm without and the fear within. Alara sat on the floor by the cot, her hand on Leo's chest, feeling the frantic, fluttery beat of his heart. She watched the silent man in the chair, his silhouette stark against the flickering firelight. In the depths of her fear, a profound shift was occurring. Her caution, her suspicion, the high walls she had built around her heart, they were beginning to crumble. This man, this stranger, was sharing their crisis. He was offering his warmth, his strength, his wakefulness, without asking for anything in return. He was simply there. Toward dawn, the fever peaked. Leo's small body was racked with shivers, and he cried out in his delirium. Alara held him, rocking him, her own tears falling silently onto his hot skin. She felt a presence beside her and looked up to see Silas kneeling on the floor, holding out a cloth dipped in cool water. His face was etched with exhaustion and a deep, painful empathy. She hesitated for only a second before taking it from him. Their fingers brushed, the first time they had ever touched. His skin was rough, warm. She let him stay. She let him help her bathe the boy's face and arms. Their movements synchronized in a silent, desperate dance to bring the fever down. The storm raged outside, but inside the small cabin, a different kind of storm was passing. By the time the first pale, gray light of morning filtered through the ice-caked window, the blizzard had begun to subside. And Leo's fever had broken. He was sleeping peacefully, his breathing deep and even, his skin cool to the touch. Alara slumped against the wall, drained of all strength. Silas was still there, kneeling on the floor. He looked at the sleeping boy, and a long, slow breath escaped his lips, a breath he seemed to have been holding all night. He looked at her, and for the first time, the emptiness in his eyes was filled with something else. Relief. He gave her a single, solemn nod, then rose stiffly and retreated to his side of the room, leaving his blanket on the boy. The wall between them was still there, but he had spent the night standing guard in the doorway, and she had let him. The thaw came slowly, both outside and in. The blizzard blew itself out, leaving a world of pristine, silent white. The sun emerged, weak at first, then stronger, casting a blinding glare off the snow. Inside the cabin, the heavy silence that had defined their existence began to lighten, to change its texture. It was no longer the silence of strangers, of suspicion. It was a quieter, more comfortable quiet, freighted with the shared experience of the long, dark night. Leo recovered quickly, his youthful resilience a small miracle. He spent his days sitting by the fire, clutching his wooden horse, his eyes following Silas with a new, curious reverence. The man who had sat by his bed, who had covered him with his own blanket, was no longer a frightening shadow. A few days after the storm, as Alara was preparing their evening meal, she spoke. The words felt strange in her mouth, rusty from disuse. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "For Leo. For the blanket." Silas was mending a piece of tack by the fire. He stopped his work, his hands stilling. He didn't look up immediately. He seemed to be considering her words, weighing them. Finally, he lifted his gaze to hers. "He's a good boy," he said. It was the most he had said to her at one time since the day she'd arrived. The small exchange broke a seal. The next evening, as the shadows grew long, she found the courage to speak again. She didn't plan it. The words simply came, a story spilling out in a quiet, halting voice. She spoke of the city, of the crowded tenement, of the endless hunger. She spoke of Leo's father, a man who had promised the world and left them with nothing but debts and a broken heart. She didn't tell him everything. She left out the worst of the humiliation, the desperation that had led her to answer a stranger's advertisement. But she gave him pieces of her past, small, broken shards of the life she had fled. Silas listened. He sat in his chair, his hands resting on his knees, his eyes on the fire. He did not interrupt. He did not judge. He simply absorbed her words, offering her the gift of his quiet attention. When she fell silent, her story told, the cabin was quiet for a long time. Then he spoke, his own voice low and rough with memory. "I had a wife," he said, the words seeming to be pulled from a great depth. "Her name was Mary, and a daughter, Lily." He paused, and the silence that followed was filled with a pain so profound Alara could almost feel it in the air. "It was a fever, like the boys, but it came on fast. I was out on a long cattle drive. By the time I got the news, by the time I got back, it was too late." He swallowed hard, his throat working. "I wasn't here. I should have been here." The guilt she had seen in his eyes on that first day finally had a name. It was the guilt of a man who believed he had failed the people he loved most. He had built this solitary life as a penance, a fortress of solitude to punish himself. He had seen Leo's fever and been thrown back into the heart of his own worst memory. His desperate, all-night vigil had not just been for Leo. It had been for Lily, too. It had been his chance to do what he had not been able to do before. Alara's heart ached with a sudden, overwhelming wave of compassion. She finally understood the source of his kindness, his distance. He was kind because he knew the terrible cost of its absence. He was distant because he was terrified of letting anyone close again, terrified of another loss. She did not offer words of comfort. She knew they would be useless against such a long-held grief. Instead, she did the only thing she could think to do. She finished preparing the stew, ladled it into 2 bowls, and for the first time, she placed a bowl not on the hearth for him, but on the table opposite her own. She sat down. She waited. After a long moment, Silas rose from his chair by the fire. He walked to the table and sat down across from her. He picked up his spoon. They ate their meal in silence, together. The curtain was still there, but the line he had drawn down the middle of the cabin had been erased. Weeks passed, and the deep snows of winter began to melt, revealing the muddy, sleeping earth beneath. The routine of the cabin had changed. They ate all their meals together now, the silence between them companionable, punctuated by Leo's occasional questions, which Silas answered with a quiet patience. He had started talking to the boy, telling him the names of birds, showing him how to tie a simple knot. He spent his evenings inside, near the fire, carving another small animal for Leo, this time a wolf with its head tilted up in a silent howl. But their fragile peace was contained within the walls of the cabin. The world outside still existed, and they could not hide from it forever. Their supplies were running low. The trip to the town of Redemption was unavoidable. The thought of it filled Alara with a cold dread. The town meant people. It meant stares and whispers. It meant judgment. She had felt the weight of it that first day on the train platform. Here, in the isolation of the homestead, she was simply Alara. In town, she was the mail-order bride, the desperate woman who had sold herself to a stranger. Silas seemed to understand her hesitation. "We'll go in the morning," he said one evening, his tone leaving no room for argument. "We need flour and salt. And the boy needs sturdier boots." The next morning, he hitched the horses to the wagon. Alara dressed herself and Leo in their best, worn clothes. She braided her hair tightly, a nervous habit. The journey to town was as silent as their first one had been, but this time the silence was charged with a shared apprehension. Redemption was just as bleak and dusty as she remembered. A few people on the boardwalk of the main street stopped to stare as Silas pulled the wagon up in front of the general store. They looked from the grim, solitary rancher to the pale woman and child beside him. Alara could feel their eyes on her, could hear the unspoken questions. She kept her gaze down, her hand clutching Leo's. Silas helped her down from the wagon, his hand briefly on her elbow. The touch was firm, steadying. "Stay close," he murmured, and led them inside. The store was a cluttered space, smelling of leather, coffee, and dust. A few other customers, a pair of ranchers and a woman in a severe black dress, turned to look as they entered. The storekeeper, a balding man with shrewd eyes, gave Silas a curt nod. They gathered their supplies in silence. A sack of flour, coffee, sugar, salt. Silas picked out a pair of small, sturdy leather boots and knelt to measure them against Leo's feet. As he was doing so, the store's door swung open, a bell jangling harshly. A man stepped inside, well-dressed in a city suit that looked out of place in the dusty store. He was fleshy and florid, with a self-satisfied smile and small, predatory eyes. Alara's blood ran cold. She recognized him instantly. It was Mr. Gable, the agent from the city who had arranged her passage, the man to whom she had paid her last few dollars. His eyes swept the room and landed on her. A slow, oily smile spread across his face. "Well, well, look what the wind blew in," he said, his voice loud enough for everyone in the store to hear. "I was wondering what became of you, my dear. Didn't take to your first placement, I hear? Ran off, did we?" Alara froze, her face burning with shame. The other customers turned to stare openly now, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and contempt. Humiliation, hot and suffocating, washed over her. She wanted the floor to swallow her whole. Gable took a step closer, his gaze dismissive as it flickered over Leo. "I ought to demand my fee back from this fellow," he said, gesturing vaguely toward Silas, who was now standing slowly, his body tensed like a coiled spring. Damaged goods, it would seem. Always a risk with your kind. The store was utterly silent. Alara could hear the blood pounding in her ears. This was it. The public shame she had dreaded. The confirmation of what she was in their eyes. A commodity, used and discarded. Silas took a step forward, placing himself between Alara and Gable. He was taller than the city man, his presence suddenly formidable. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The quiet intensity in his eyes was more threatening than any shout. "That's enough," Silas said, his voice a low growl. Gable scoffed. "I have business with this woman. She broke a contract." "Her business is my business now," Silas stated, his voice flat and cold as iron. He reached back, not looking at Alara, and placed a hand on her shoulder. His grip was firm, possessive, a shield against the world. The warmth of it seeped through her thin dress, a steady anchor in the storm of her shame. The townspeople watched, their mouths agape. Then Silas did something that stunned her, and the entire room into silence. He looked directly at the storekeeper, his gaze unwavering. "Put these things on my account," he said, his voice clear and steady. Then he looked at Gable, his eyes filled with a cold fire Alara had never seen before. "This is my wife," he declared. The words were a lie, but they rang with the absolute power of truth. "And you will not speak to her again." He did not wait for a response. Keeping his hand on her shoulder, he turned and guided her and Leo out of the store, leaving Gable sputtering and the townspeople staring in stunned silence. He led them to the wagon, lifted Leo onto the seat, and then helped her up. He moved with a purpose she had never witnessed, a raw, protective anger that was all for her. He had not just defended her. He had claimed her. In front of everyone, he had drawn a line in the dust, placing her firmly and irrevocably on his side. He had redeemed her in the only way that mattered, not with piety, but with a fierce public dignity. He had kept his promise. He had been kind. The ride back to the homestead was steeped in a new kind of silence. It was not the silence of strangers, nor the comfortable quiet of shared grief. It was a silence charged with the weight of the words Silas had spoken in the store. "My wife." The lie hung in the air between them, shimmering with possibilities she was too afraid to consider. She stole glances at his profile as he drove. His jaw was set, his gaze fixed on the horizon, his expression unreadable. He had defended her, shielded her, but what did it mean? Was it an act of pity? An act of possession? Or something more? She did not know, and she was terrified to hope. When they arrived back at the cabin, the familiar landscape felt different, changed. Silas unhitched the horses and led them to the barn without a word. Alara took Leo inside, her body trembling with the aftershocks of the confrontation. The cabin, which had become a sanctuary, now felt tense, the air thick with unspoken questions. She put away the supplies, her movements stiff and automatic. She knelt and helped Leo try on his new boots. They were a perfect fit. He stomped around the small room, a wide grin on his face, oblivious to the emotional storm that had just passed. The simple, solid sound of his new boots on the wooden floor was a comfort, a small anchor to the present moment. Silas came in from the barn, his face still grim. He didn't look at her. He went to the hearth and began to build up the fire, his movements sharp and precise. The tension was unbearable. Alara knew she had to say something, to acknowledge what he had done for her. "Silas," she began, her voice barely audible. He stopped what he was doing but did not turn. "What you said in the store," she faltered, unsure how to continue. "Thank you." He remained with his back to her for a long moment. Then he turned slowly. The anger was gone from his eyes, replaced by that familiar, deep-running weariness. "No one should speak to you that way," he said, his voice low. "No one." And that was all. He did not take back his words. He did not explain them. He simply let them stand. But something fundamental had shifted between them. The lie he had told in town had built a bridge over the chasm of their separate lives. By calling her his wife, he had given her a name, a place. He had declared to the world that she belonged somewhere, that she belonged with him. In the days that followed, the change was palpable. He began to eat his meals at the table not out of a shared, somber duty, but as if it were the most natural thing in the world. He started to talk more, not about his past, but about the ranch, the cattle, the signs of the coming spring. He would point out a hawk circling high in the sky to Leo, or explain how to read the clouds for weather. He was teaching the boy, including him in his world. One evening, he brought a piece of lumber into the cabin. He worked by the firelight, his knife and a small saw moving with a quiet skill. Alara watched him, her mending forgotten in her lap. He was shaping the wood, sanding it, fitting pieces together with a craftsman's care. Over several nights, it took form. It was a small rocking chair, perfectly sized for her. When it was finished, he sanded it one last time until it was smooth as silk. He did not present it to her with a flourish. He simply placed it by the hearth, in the spot where she often sat on a stool to do her sewing. He stepped back and looked at it, then at her. His eyes held a question. She stood up and walked to the chair. She ran her hand over the smooth, curved back. It was a beautiful, simple thing, made with care and intention. It was a gift. It was an invitation. She sat down in it, and it fit her perfectly. She gave a gentle push with her foot, and the chair began to rock with a soft, rhythmic creak. It was the sound of contentment, the sound of peace, the sound of a home. She looked up at Silas, who was watching her, a faint, shy smile touching his lips for the first time. She smiled back, a true, warm smile that reached her eyes. No other words were needed. He had built her a place to sit. He had built her a place to stay. The seasons turned, melting into one another. Spring arrived, painting the plains in a riot of wildflowers. Summer followed, with its long, hot days and chorus of cicadas. The cabin was no longer just a shelter. It was a home, filled with the small sounds of a life being built together. Leo's laughter, once so rare, now echoed in the small space as Silas taught him to skip stones and whittle his own small, clumsy animal figures. The silence that remained between Alara and Silas was no longer a void, but a shared space, a language of comfortable companionship. They worked side by side, he in the fields and barn, she in the cabin and the small vegetable garden she had planted near the porch. His promise of kindness had been more than just an absence of cruelty. It had been a seed, and in the fertile ground of their shared loneliness, it had taken root and grown into something strong and quiet and true. The rocking chair became the center of their evenings. After the supper dishes were cleared and Leo was asleep, they would sit in the soft glow of the firelight, Alara in her rocker, Silas in his straight-backed chair. Sometimes they talked. More often, they sat in a silence that was richer and more meaningful than any conversation. The rhythmic creak of the rocker was the heartbeat of their new life, a steady, reassuring sound against the vast, quiet expanse of the plains. From silence had come warmth. From hardship had come strength. From two broken, solitary people, a family was being forged. Silas would watch her as she rocked, her hands busy with mending or knitting, and the deep, abiding guilt in his eyes was slowly, surely being replaced by a gentle, steady light. He was no longer just atoning for the past. He was building a future. He had offered her shelter from the wind, and in doing so had found a shelter for his own wounded heart. The cabin was no longer just his. It was theirs. Winter returned, circling back as it always did. But this time it was not a threat to be endured. It was a season to be met together. The wind howled outside, but inside the cabin, the fire burned bright and warm. The larder was full, the woodpile high. The small home was a bastion of warmth and light against the desolate, frozen landscape. One night, the snow fell thick and fast, blanketing the world in a profound and peaceful silence. Leo was fast asleep in his cot, the carved wolf clutched in his hand. The only sounds in the room were the crackle of the logs in the fireplace and the soft, steady creak of the rocking chair. The coat Silas had bought for her in town, a thick wool coat to replace her threadbare one, hung on a wooden peg by the door. It was no longer a new object, but a familiar one, a permanent fixture, a symbol of his quiet, constant care. Alara sat in the rocker, her hands still in her lap, watching the flames dance. Silas sat in his chair beside her. The space between them was small, comfortable. He had been so still for so long. She thought he might have fallen asleep. But then he moved. He reached out, his large, calloused hand covering hers where it rested on the arm of the rocker. His touch was warm, firm, a simple, solid weight. It was not a gesture of passion, but of deep, abiding connection. It was a question, a statement, and a promise, all without a single word. She did not pull away. She did not flinch. She simply turned her hand over, her fingers lacing with his. A silent answer to a silent question. She stayed.